You need a husband, and I need a mama." The little girl's words sliced through the Dakota wind, sharper than any shard of ice. Linda Whitfore stood frozen on the platform. The train was gone. The man who'd promised her a future, a man named Walter Briggs, had simply vanished into thin air. Before her stood two children. Their coats were threadbare, their eyes ancient. "Our pa's alone," the girl said again, her chin lifted against the biting cold. "And you," she added, her gaze sweeping over Linda's worn-out bag, "you look like you've got nowhere else to go." The truth of it burned in Linda's throat. She'd come all this way for a promise, for a ring, for a new life. But maybe salvation wasn't a piece of paper. Maybe it was the small, frozen hand of a stranger reaching out in the middle of a blizzard. The boy next to her, Tommy, didn't speak. He just clung to his sister's sleeve, his tiny fingers red and raw where his mittens should have been. He shifted from one broken boot to the other, and Linda saw the twine holding the leather together. His bottom lip trembled, a silent battle against the cold and fear. Linda's chest felt like it was being squeezed by an invisible hand. The snow wasn't falling anymore. It was flying sideways, a blinding white wall that swallowed the world. "Miss, you can't stay here," the station clerk yelled from the doorway, his breath a cloud of steam. "Sun's dropping fast. This storm'll take you." She turned back to the children. Their faces were pale and thin, but their eyes held a fierce intelligence. They were survivors. "I don't even know your pa," Linda managed, her voice shaking. "You will," the girl answered, her voice as steady as a river stone. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old. "He's got land, a house. He's got us. He won't turn you away." Linda clutched her bag tighter. Walter Briggs had written letters filled with poetry about rolling hills and a warm fire. But Walter wasn't here. Only his ghost, fading into the howl of the wind. Tommy's teeth began to chatter. A single, desperate word escaped his lips. "Please." Her heart cracked. She looked around the empty platform. The last wagon had already disappeared into the storm. This was it. She could wait for a man who wasn't coming and freeze to death alone. Or she could follow 2 orphans into a blizzard, toward a man she'd never met. The girl, Annie, raised a bare hand. Her fingers were chapped and cracked. "Come on," she said, her voice softer now. "You'll die out here." Linda's throat was raw. She set down her bag, knelt into the snow, and took the girl's small hand in her own gloved one. It was colder than stone. A faint smile, a flicker of pure relief, crossed Annie's face. "I'm Annie," she said. "This is Tommy." "Linda," she whispered, the name feeling foreign on her own tongue. They pulled her forward, down the steps and into the storm. The world was a swirling vortex of white. Snow clawed at her dress, the wind tore at her bonnet. But through the chaos, she saw it. A thin, fragile line of smoke rising against the gray sky. A promise. Her heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She thought of Walter's empty promises, the life that had been snatched away. Then she looked at Annie's determined little face and Tommy's shivering shoulders. Whatever was at the end of this path, it couldn't be worse than being abandoned. It had to be better. And so, Linda followed them into the storm. The fence was barely standing, its boards leaning like tired old men, patched with rope and prayer. Beyond it, the house emerged from the swirling snow. It was low and weathered, its roof sagging slightly in the middle, as if it had been carrying a heavy burden for a very long time. But the smoke, that steady column of smoke, kept rising. It was a sign of life, a sign of fire, a sign of hope. Annie shouldered the gate open, and they stepped into the yard. Tommy stumbled, and without thinking, Linda scooped him into her arms. He was terrifyingly light. She could feel the sharp angles of his bones through his thin coat. He didn't protest. He just laid his head on her shoulder, a gesture of absolute, heartbreaking trust. The front door opened before they could knock. A wave of heat rolled out, smelling of wood smoke and something baking, maybe bread. The inside was a single long room, dim and cluttered but undeniably alive. A huge cast-iron stove glowed in one corner, dominating the space. A long table, its surface scarred with decades of use, ran down the center. Shelves lined the walls, crowded with mismatched jars and bundled herbs. It was a house built for survival, not for show. Linda hesitated on the threshold, stamping snow from her boots. Her hands were trembling. This was it, the moment of truth. A door at the far end of the room opened. A man stepped through. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of raw strength that comes from working the land. His sleeves were rolled up to his elbows, despite the cold, showing powerful forearms. His hair was dark. His face was all sharp angles, carved by wind and worry. A thin white scar sliced through one eyebrow. But it was his eyes that stopped her breath. They were gray as a winter sky, and they held no expression at all. They were completely, utterly unreadable. "Pa," Annie said, her voice bright and cheerful. "We brought her." The man's gaze swept over Linda. It wasn't welcoming. It wasn't hostile. It was just measuring. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask why 2 children had dragged her out of a blizzard and onto his floor. He just nodded toward a wooden chair by the stove. His voice was low, a quiet rumble that carried an unspoken command. "Sit." Pride told her to stand her ground, to demand an explanation. But the fire was pulling at her, a siren song to her frozen bones. Her legs ached with a deep, shuddering cold. She set her bag down and sank into the chair, letting the glorious heat wash over her. Without a word, the man ladled thick, steaming soup from a pot on the stove and set the bowl on the table in front of her. The smell of meat and onions and carrots rose up, and her stomach clenched with a hunger so sharp it was painful. "Thank you," she murmured. He didn't reply. He walked over to a small workbench in the corner, picked up a block of wood and a wicked-looking knife, and began to carve. The only sounds in the room were the hiss and crackle of the fire, the whisper of his knife against the wood, and the children, who had curled up on a raggedy rug, their hushed giggles like tiny bells in the heavy silence. Linda picked up the spoon. Her hand was shaking so badly she could barely hold it steady. The soup was simple, but it was hot and rich, and the warmth spread through her chest, pushing back the ice that had taken root there. For the first time all day, she felt the tight knot of fear in her stomach begin to loosen. But the questions remained, buzzing in her head like angry hornets. Who was this man, Elias Monroe? Why was he so silent? And where was Walter Briggs, the man who was supposed to be here? What kind of life was this, in a house filled with secrets and shadows? The storm raged outside, but the silence inside was a storm of its own. Linda finished the soup, placing the spoon carefully back in the empty bowl. His silence was a wall, and she was on the outside. This wasn't a welcome. It was just a temporary truce with the cold. But sometimes, a truce was all you needed to survive the night. As she watched him carve, the firelight catching the sharp planes of his face, she noticed his hands. His knuckles were bruised, the skin scraped raw and bloody, as if he'd been in a brutal fight. A fresh wave of cold, colder than the blizzard, washed over her. Who had this man been fighting? The whispers started before the snow had even melted. Like a foul wind, they followed Linda every time she stepped foot in town. She could feel the stares, sharp and pointed, from the women in their bonnets at the general store. Their voices would drop to a conspiratorial hush the second she walked through the door. The men would stop talking, their eyes sliding over her, a mixture of curiosity and contempt. She was the mail-order bride nobody claimed, the woman who just appeared. She didn't fit their neat little boxes, and they hated her for it. At first, Linda threw herself into the work, hoping to build a fortress of chores around herself. She rose before the sun, her hands quickly growing calloused from scrubbing floors, kneading dough, and mending worn-out clothes. The farmhouse, once hollow and silent, began to fill with the small sounds of life. The children became her shadows. Annie would leave her little drawings, clumsy pictures of flowers and birds, under Linda's pillow. Tommy, who had been so quiet and fearful, started falling asleep in her lap by the fire, his small hand clutching her sleeve as if he was afraid she'd disappear. They were her anchors in this strange new world. But Elias remained a ghost in his own home. He was a man made of silence and shadows. He ate the food she cooked, wore the clothes she mended, and watched her with those unreadable gray eyes, but he never let her in. There was a wall around his heart, and it was higher and colder than any mountain. His distance hurt more than any of the town's cruel whispers. One evening, as the sun bled orange and purple across the snow-covered fields, she was carrying a bucket of scraps to the chickens. She saw them then, two of the neighbor women, standing by the fence line, their heads together, watching her. When they saw she'd spotted them, they quickly pretended to be admiring the sunset, but their eyes never left her. A hot, bitter anger rose in her chest. She wanted to scream at them, to tell them they knew nothing about her, nothing about the cold and the fear and the desperation. But the words caught in her throat, heavy and useless. Later that night, the children were asleep, and the only sound was the crackle of the fire. Elias sat at the table, carving. Always carving. The knife moved in slow, deliberate strokes, peeling away layers of wood to reveal the shape hidden inside. Linda finished drying the last dish, her hands raw from the harsh soap. She watched him, the steady, rhythmic movement of his hand. Finally, she couldn't stand the silence any longer. "Do you hear them?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "The whispers." Elias didn't look up from his work. "I hear plenty." "And you say nothing," she pressed, her voice gaining a sharp edge. "You let them think I'm just some stray you took in out of pity." The knife stopped. Slowly, deliberately, Elias set it down on the table. He lifted his head, and his gray eyes met hers. For the first time, she saw a crack in his armor. She saw a flash of a deep, ancient pain. "You think words can stop them?" he said, his voice a low growl. "You think I haven't been carrying their whispers my whole life? Let them talk. Their words don't mean a thing." "They matter when your children hear them," she shot back, her voice trembling with a sudden fierce protectiveness. "They matter when Annie and Tommy grow up believing their mama was nothing more than a piece of dirt." The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. On the rug, Annie murmured in her sleep. Elias leaned back in his chair, his face half hidden in the shadows. His gaze was intense, searching. "Then prove them wrong," he said at last. The words hit her like a physical blow. It wasn't an offer of help. It wasn't a promise of protection. It was a challenge, a line drawn in the dirt. As he spoke, his eyes flickered, just for a second, to a heavy, iron-bound chest that sat in the darkest corner of the room. It was the one piece of furniture she had never been allowed to touch. It was always locked. Linda stood there, her heart pounding in her chest. A new resolve hardened within her. She would prove them wrong. She would prove him wrong. She would fight for these children, for this fragile, broken family. And she would find out what secrets he was hiding in that locked chest. The blizzard came out of nowhere. One moment, the sky was a pale, fragile blue. The next, the world was gone, erased by a solid wall of white. The wind shrieked like a banshee, throwing itself against the little farmhouse, rattling the windows in their frames. The old house groaned, its timbers protesting the assault. Annie and Tommy huddled by the fire, their eyes wide and frightened. Elias paced the floor, his jaw clenched tight. "The barn," he muttered, his voice tight with tension. "The livestock. The doors won't hold." He grabbed his heavy coat from its peg by the door. "You can't go out in that," Linda said, stepping in front of him. "You'll be killed." "I don't have a choice," he bit out, his voice as sharp as the wind. He pushed past her, wrenched the door open, and was swallowed by the storm. A blast of Arctic air slammed into the room, stealing the warmth from the fire before the door banged shut behind him. The children started to cry, soft, terrified whimpers. Annie clutched a little wooden doll Elias had carved for her. Tommy buried his face in Linda's skirt, his small body trembling. The storm was a living thing, a monster trying to tear the house apart. Every gust felt like a fist pounding on the walls. Linda held the children close, murmuring reassurances she didn't feel. The minutes stretched into an eternity. An hour passed, then another. Elias did not return. A cold, sickening dread coiled in Linda's stomach. She couldn't just sit here, waiting. Not while the children looked at her with such desperate hope. She wrapped them both in heavy blankets, moving them as close to the fire as was safe. "Stay right here," she commanded, her voice firm, hiding the tremor in her hands. "Don't you move, no matter what you hear." Annie's chin wobbled. "Where are you going?" Linda knelt down, her heart aching at the fear in the little girl's eyes. "I'm going to bring your pa back." She pulled on her own worn coat and a pair of Elias's oversized gloves. Taking a deep breath, she opened the door and stepped out into the maelstrom. The force of the wind almost knocked her off her feet. The snow was like 1,000 tiny needles against her exposed skin. She couldn't see more than a few feet in front of her. The world was a screaming, white chaos. She tied a rope she'd grabbed from by the door around her waist, securing the other end to the porch railing. It was her only lifeline. Step by agonizing step, she fought her way toward the barn, leaning into the wind, her boots sinking deep into the ever-growing drifts. She found the barn more by memory than by sight. One of the huge doors had been torn from its upper hinge and was flapping violently in the wind, a broken wing. The terrified sounds of the animals inside were almost lost in the roar of the storm. Using every ounce of her strength, she wrestled the door back into place, her fingers numb and clumsy on the heavy iron latch. Finally, it clicked shut. The inside of the barn was dark and filled with the panicked energy of the animals. And then she saw him. Elias was slumped against a support beam, half buried in a pile of hay. His coat was torn, and a dark stain of blood matted his hair at his temple. A heavy plank lay on the ground beside him. He was terrifyingly still. For a second, sheer terror paralyzed her. Then, something else rose up inside her. A white-hot rage, a fierce, primal determination. "Oh, no, you don't!" she snarled, dropping to her knees beside him. She shook him hard. "You don't get to die! You don't get to leave them! You don't get to leave me!" His eyelids fluttered. His gray eyes were unfocused, glassy. He tried to mumble something, but she put a hand on his chest. "Save it." Getting him to his feet was the hardest thing she had ever done. He was a dead weight, his body limp and unresponsive. She draped one of his heavy arms over her shoulders and began the impossible journey back to the house, dragging him through the snow. The storm fought her every step of the way, trying to rip him from her grasp, but she held on, fueled by a strength she never knew she possessed. The image of Annie and Tommy's faces, waiting in the firelight, burned in her mind. She burst back through the door, half carrying, half dragging Elias. Annie gasped. Tommy cried out his name. Linda collapsed with him onto the floor by the hearth, her lungs burning, her body shaking with exhaustion. Elias groaned, his eyes slowly focusing on her face, and for the first time, she saw the wall in his eyes crumble. There was no more silence, no more distance, just raw, unguarded awe. As she gently cleaned the gash on his head with a damp cloth, her fingers brushed against a thin leather cord around his neck, tucked beneath his shirt. Curious, she gently pulled it out. It was a small silver locket, tarnished with age. Her heart skipped a beat. A picture of his late wife, Mary, she presumed. With trembling fingers, she pried it open. It was empty. The storm broke, leaving behind a world scrubbed clean and silent, draped in a thick blanket of white. But the whispers in town, once the roads were cleared, came back stronger than ever. They now had a new story to tell, the story of the strange woman who had saved Elias Monroe's life. But instead of respect, their words were laced with suspicion. What kind of woman would do such a thing? What did she want from him? Linda ignored them. Something had shifted in the little farmhouse. The storm had broken more than just the barn door. It had broken the silence. Elias started to talk. Not much at first. Just a word here and there. A thank you when she brought him his coffee. A quiet comment about the weather. But it was a start. The heavy, suffocating silence was gone, replaced by a fragile, tentative peace. He still spent his evenings carving, but now, sometimes he would look up and watch her as she taught the children their letters by the firelight. And in his eyes, she no longer saw a stranger. She saw a man wrestling with his own ghosts. The empty locket became an obsession for her. She would see it sometimes when his shirt was unbuttoned at the neck. Why would a man wear an empty locket? It made no sense. It was another piece of the puzzle of Elias Monroe, another secret locked away. One rainy afternoon, when Elias was out mending the fences that the storm had brought down, Linda decided she couldn't wait any longer. She had to know what was in the iron-bound chest. While sweeping, she'd found a small, rusted key that had fallen behind a loose floorboard. Her heart pounded as she retrieved it. It had to be the key. With trembling hands, she knelt before the chest. The key slid into the lock. It turned with a rusty groan. She lifted the heavy lid. The inside was filled with the faint, sad scent of lavender and dust. On top lay a neatly folded woman's shawl, its colors faded. Beneath it, a small leather-bound Bible, and under the Bible, a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. Her hands shook as she untied the ribbon. These must be the letters from his late wife, Mary. A part of her felt guilty, like she was trespassing on sacred ground. But another, stronger part of her needed to understand the man who was slowly, tentatively, letting her into his life. She unfolded the first letter. The handwriting was neat, feminine, but the words made the blood run cold in her veins. Mary, you know what you owe me. The debt is past due. Don't think you can hide out here in the middle of nowhere. I will find you, and when I do, you will pay. It wasn't signed with a name, just an initial. W. Linda's breath caught in her throat. She frantically opened another letter. The words were even more menacing. Your husband thinks you were a saint. Does he know about the life you led before you met him? Does he know about the things you did to survive? Pay me, Mary, or I will tell him everything. Linda's head was spinning. This wasn't a grieving widower's collection of love letters. This was blackmail. She reached the last letter in the bundle. This one was different. It was crumpled, as if it had been clenched in a fist. The handwriting was almost illegible. I know what you and Pike did. I saw you. You drove her out into that storm. You killed her. This one was signed. The name leaped off the page, a ghost from her own past, a name she had tried so hard to forget. Walter Briggs. The room tilted. Walter Briggs. The man who was supposed to marry her. The man who had abandoned her on that train platform. He knew Elias. He knew Mary. He was connected to all of this. Suddenly, it all clicked into place. The whispers of the town. Elias's silence. His bruised knuckles on the day she arrived. Arland Pike's sneering hatred. They weren't just gossiping about her. They were guarding a dark, terrible secret. And she had just walked right into the middle of it. The knowledge changed everything. It was like a lens snapping into focus, bringing the fuzzy, confusing details of her new life into sharp, terrifying clarity. Arland Pike wasn't just a cruel gossip. He was a potential murderer. The town's whispers weren't just idle chatter. They were a wall of silence protecting one of their own. And Elias. His silence wasn't just grief. It was guilt. It was rage. It was the heavy burden of a secret he couldn't share. The very air in the farmhouse felt different, charged with unspoken words and hidden dangers. When Pike and his men rode into the yard a few days later, Linda wasn't just afraid. She was furious. "Well, now," Pike drawled, his eyes full of a greasy satisfaction as they swept over Linda on the porch. "Seems the rumors are true. The unclaimed bride, playing mama to another man's children." Annie and Tommy shrank behind her skirts, but Linda didn't move. She held his gaze, her heart pounding a steady, defiant rhythm. Elias came out of the barn, an axe held loosely in one hand. His face was a thundercloud. "Pike, if you've come about the boundary line, state your business. If you've come to cast insults, get off my land." Pike laughed, a nasty grating sound. "Just a friendly warning, Monroe. The town doesn't hold with this kind of, arrangement. A woman's reputation is all she has. And this one," his eyes bored into Linda, "her reputation is already in the dirt. Before, those words would have cut her to the bone. Now they were nothing. She knew the truth. She knew who the real filth was. She stepped forward, her voice ringing out clear and strong in the cold spring air. "A reputation didn't keep these children warm during the blizzard, Mr. Pike. A piece of paper didn't pull their father from a collapsed barn. I did. You talk about my reputation, but what about yours? What about a man who preys on the weak, who helps drive a terrified woman out into a storm to her death?" The yard went dead silent. The wind rustled the leaves in the cottonwood trees. Pike's sneer vanished, replaced by a flicker of shock, then rage. The men behind him shifted uneasily in their saddles. They knew. They all knew. Before Pike could recover, Elias stepped forward and, with a powerful swing, drove the axe blade deep into a chopping block. The sound cracked through the silence like a gunshot. "She stays," Elias said, his voice low and deadly. "And if any man here has a problem with that, he can settle it with me. Right now." No one moved. The laughter was gone. The bravado had evaporated. Pike's face was a mask of hatred. He yanked on his horse's reins, turning the animal so sharply it whinnied in protest. "This isn't over, Monroe," he spat, digging his heels into the horse's flanks and galloping away, his men scrambling to follow. Linda stood, her fists clenched, her body trembling with adrenaline. Slowly she turned to look at Elias. He was watching her, and the look in his eyes made her breath catch. It was more than respect. It was more than gratitude. It was the look of a man who had just seen his last hope, his last chance at redemption, stand up and fight a battle he thought he had to fight alone. That night, after the children were asleep, Linda walked over to the table where Elias sat. She placed the bundle of letters, tied neatly again with the blue ribbon, in front of him. He didn't look at them. He just looked at her. "You know?" he said. It wasn't a question. "I know," she answered. And then the story came pouring out of him. The words, held back for so long, flooded the small room. He told her about Mary, about the secrets she'd kept, about the blackmail. He told her how Pike had been Walter Briggs's partner in crime, how they had tormented Mary for months. On the night of the blizzard, they had come to the house, demanding the last of her money. She had run from them, out into the storm. Elias had been in town, buying supplies. By the time he got back, it was too late. He found her the next morning, less than a mile from the house. The town, they called it a tragic accident, he said, his voice thick with self-loathing. They knew. They all knew what Pike was, but it was easier to look the other way. "And Walter Briggs?" Linda asked, her voice barely a whisper. "He disappeared after that," Elias said, his hands clenching into fists. "I got your letter, the one you sent to Briggs telling him which train you'd be on. I went to the station that day not to meet you, but to meet him. To finally get justice for Mary." He looked down at his scarred knuckles. "We fought. He got away. But he's not gone. He's still out there." The empty locket. It all made sense now. It wasn't for a picture of Mary. It was a reminder of the emptiness she had left behind, of the justice he had failed to get. Linda reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "You're not alone in this fight anymore, Elias." He looked up, his gray eyes shining with unshed tears. For the first time since she had arrived, he smiled. A small, broken, but real smile. And in that moment, Linda knew. She wasn't just a stray. She wasn't just a temporary solution. She was home. The truth didn't bring peace. It brought war. Knowing that Pike and Briggs were still out there, a shadow lingering over their fragile happiness, changed the rhythm of their days. Elias was no longer just a silent farmer. He was a sentinel, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. Linda felt it too, a low thrum of anxiety that never quite went away. Every snap of a twig in the woods, every rider on the distant road, sent a jolt of fear through her. But the fear also forged them together. They were a unit now, bound by a shared secret and a common enemy. The nights were filled with quiet conversations, the silences comfortable, the small touches, a hand on her shoulder, a shared glance across the sleeping children, speaking volumes. They were building something real, something solid, in the midst of the danger. The town noticed the change. The whispers didn't stop, but their tone shifted. There was a new respect, a grudging admiration for the woman who stood by Elias Monroe's side, unflinching. They saw the light back in his eyes. They heard the children's easy laughter. Linda was healing them. The confrontation came on a hot, dry summer evening. The air was thick and still, the sky bruised with the promise of a thunderstorm. A lone rider appeared on the ridge, silhouetted against the setting sun. It was Walter Briggs. Elias saw him first. He sent Linda and the children into the house, his face grim. "Bar the door, and don't open it, for anyone." Linda's heart hammered against her ribs, but she did as he said, herding the terrified children into the small root cellar beneath the floorboards. She waited in the dark, listening. She heard voices. Briggs, his tone oily and confident. And then another voice. Pike. They had come together. "We know she's in there, Monroe," Pike shouted. "And we know she found the letters. Give her to us. Give us the letters, and we'll leave you and your brats in peace." "Get off my land!" Elias's voice boomed hard as granite. There was a moment of silence. Then the sickeningly sweet smell of kerosene. Linda's blood ran cold. "Last chance, Monroe," Pike yelled, "or we burn you out." Suddenly a new sound, hoofbeats, dozens of them, shouts, men's voices rising in anger. Linda crept to the small cellar window, peering out. The yard was filled with men, the neighbors, the same men who had whispered and stared. They were carrying rifles and lanterns, their faces set and grim. They had formed a silent, menacing circle around Pike and Briggs. Old man Hemlock, who owned the next farm over, stepped forward. "You've caused enough trouble here, Pike," he said, his voice gravelly with age. "We looked the other way once. We're not doing it again." Pike and Briggs were trapped. Panic flashed across their faces. They had counted on the town's fear, its apathy. They had miscalculated. In that moment, Linda understood. Her standing up to Pike, her unwavering defense of her new family, had done more than just earn Elias's respect. It had shamed the town into action. It had reminded them that community wasn't about gossip and judgment. It was about protecting your own. The standoff didn't last long. Faced with a dozen armed farmers, Pike and Briggs threw down their weapons. The sheriff, who had ridden up with the posse, put them in irons. As he led them away, Pike's eyes met Linda's through the window. They were filled with a venomous, impotent hatred. It was over. The ghosts were finally being banished. When the yard was quiet again, Elias unbarred the door. Linda ran into his arms, the tears she had been holding back finally streaming down her face. He held her tight, his face buried in her hair. "It's over," he whispered. "It's finally over." The children came scrambling out of the cellar, their faces streaked with dirt and tears, and wrapped their arms around both of them, a tangle of limbs and relief. They stood there for a long time, a family, whole and unbroken, as the first drops of the long-awaited rain began to fall. The rain washed the land clean. It settled the dust, nourished the dry earth, and seemed to wash away the last lingering shadows of the past. The whispers in town were replaced by friendly nods and genuine smiles. The women at the general store now saved her the best cuts of bacon. The men tipped their hats. She wasn't the mail-order bride who wasn't wanted anymore. She was Linda Monroe. She belonged. One evening, as the sun set, casting a golden glow over the fields, Elias came and sat next to her on the porch swing. He was holding something in his hands. He set it gently in her lap. It was a faded cotton apron, worn soft with years of love and labor. "It was Mary's," he said, his voice quiet. "She wore it every day." He took a deep breath. "I don't have a ring to give you, Linda. But I have this land. I have my children. And I have a heart that you brought back to life." He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers. "Will you be my wife?" Tears blurred her vision. She couldn't speak. She could only nod, clutching the soft fabric of the apron to her chest. From the doorway, Annie's voice, bright and triumphant, rang out. "Does this mean you're staying forever?" Linda laughed through her tears, kneeling down to hug both children as they rushed out to join them. "It means I'm your mama forever," she whispered. "No matter what." Elias stood over them, his strong, silent presence a promise of safety and love. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, newly carved wooden bird, its wings outstretched as if in flight. It was different from the others he had carved. This one was intricately detailed, perfect. He handed it to her. "For you," he said simply. Later that night, Linda stepped out onto the porch. The air was sweet with the smell of wet earth and blooming wildflowers. She hung the new bird from the beam next to the others, a tiny wooden symbol of their completed family. She looked out over the dark, peaceful land. She had come here seeking a new life, a simple arrangement of convenience. She had found something so much more. She had found a home, built not on promises written in letters, but on the hard-won foundation of courage, loyalty, and a love that had bloomed in the harshest of winters. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell. Let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Your own story matters, and just like Linda's, it might begin with a single, unexpected moment that changes absolutely everything.